Hello and welcome. This is Jennifer McGuire for Scrapbook and Cards Today. In the most recent issue, I shared 3 fun ways to use embossing powder on your cards and scrapbook pages. These include layering your powders, an ombre background, and a resist effect. Here I'm going to show you a closer look at each of these techniques. Let's start with the layering of embossing powders, and that's what I did on the tree you see here. This is a great way to get some texture and some bold color against a darker background. I have a circle that I have die cut from a My Favorite Things circle die. It does little faux stitching around the edges, and I die cut this from some light blue cardstock. You could use any color cardstock you would like. Now I'm rubbing the surface with my anti-static powder tool just to make sure that the powder doesn't stick where I don't want it. And I'm inking up a Hero Arts tree stamp with Versamark ink. You can see the stamp set here on the left. It's designed to layer all of these tree images on top of each other to build like a layered stamped image. So I'm starting with the base, the most solid image, and I'm going to heat emboss that with a dark green embossing powder. You can use any kind of embossing powder for this that you want. Just be sure to not tap off too much of the powder because you really want this to stay nice and solid and bold. I'm letting my heat gun get really good and hot before I bring it to the paper, and then I'll heat set that so that it's a nice, perfectly smooth heat embossed image. Stamp sets like this one where you layer images on top of each other to get a realistic looking image are very popular right now. I think they're great for creating really powerful stamped images. Okay, so now I'm taking the second image and I'm going to stamp that right on top of the first. However, you want to make sure that the first image is cooled down completely, and you want to use your anti-static powder tool again just to make sure you don't get powder where you don't want it. If you don't have an anti-static powder tool, you can use a dryer sheet. I stamped the second image with Versamark ink right on top of the first embossed image, and now I'm sprinkling on a lighter green embossing powder. This one happens to be metallic, and I'm going to heat set that. Now, you don't want to overheat this. If you overheat this, the embossing powder might kind of bleed into the first layer, so just heat it enough to the point that it turns from powder to a smooth finish, and check out that beautiful layering that you get. You don't have to do all 4 layers that are in the stamp set. You could stop here if you wanted to, but I wanted to add a little bit more. If you don't have stamp sets that are designed for layering, you can layer images you may have. Maybe you have a flower image and you could emboss over it a sentiment. So you can layer embossing of any images. Again, I've used my anti-static powder tool, stamping right on top of the third image with Versamark ink, and this time I'm going to add some white embossing powder so this looks like snow on the final tree. Now again, you want to heat this but not too much or it will bleed through. Some of the original color, that green, might show through the white, but not much. I only decided to layer the 3 different images, and now to really make it pop, I'm going right over this embossing with my ink blending tool and a little bit of blue distress ink, and just kind of making a halo around the tree. This really defines the image, and since I have heat embossed the image, it resists that ink over it, so the blue doesn't end up on the tree, just around it. So I finished off the rest of the card with a gold heat embossed sentiment. I also added some gold glitter enamel dots to the tree. And for the background, I used white pigment ink and a background stamp on a craft note card. I really like the look of layered embossing powder because you can do this on a darker colored cardstock and the cardstock color doesn't show through. If you didn't emboss this and you just used dye ink, the blue would show through the tree and you wouldn't get a vibrant image. This brings us to our second technique, and that is using embossing powder to create an ombre background. You can see the stars on the black note card fade from red to orange to yellow in the background, and this is really easy to achieve with embossing powder. I have a black note card that I'm using my anti-static powder tool on just to keep the embossing nice and crisp, and I'm inking up a star background stamp from My Favorite Things with Versamark ink, and I'm going to stamp this onto the background. Again, one of the great things about using heat embossing is that you can do bold, bright colors against dark cardstocks and get great results. To create the colorful blended stars in the background, I'm going to start with red embossing powder towards the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and pour this right onto our stamped image. Then I'm going to take my fingers to just sprinkle a little bit of the powder in the area next to it so it fades off. This is really important to getting a nice blended look with the next color. Okay, so now I'm moving on to the orange embossing powder. Again, I'm going to pour this right over an area, including overlapping with the area that I sprinkled the red powder onto. So you can see I'm overlapping there, and now I'm going to use my fingers again to sprinkle on a bit of the powder. It's really important to make that blending work. And now I'm moving on to the last color, which is a yellow. You can blend any colors that you would like to together. If you wanted to go from a dark to light, you could start with, say, a red powder, then mix a little bit of red with some white embossing powder, and just do that until you blend into white. Okay, so now I'm just going to go ahead and heat set this background, and you want to make sure that you let your heat gun get good and hot before you bring it to the note card. That will prevent it from warping. I am just loving the results of this because it's hard to get a nice blending like that with just ink, so the powder is really handy. Also, embossing powders aren't very expensive. They're only a few dollars a jar, and they last you a long, long time. And there are many techniques you can do with them. I finished off this card by adding a little white panel that I stamped some lawn fawn images, and I did some coloring with Copic markers. This brings us to our last example, which is resist. This is one of my favorite techniques. There are so many things you can do with this technique, and I'm going to give you a fun little spin on it today. For this particular resist technique, I'm going to be using water, so I'm using watercolor paper. I have this great Winnie and Walter stamp set, and I took 2 leaves from the set that I'm going to repeatedly stamp with Versamark ink on the watercolor paper. Now you'll notice I have a leaf stamp on each side of my acrylic block. I just think this is faster because I can flip between the 2 sides as I alternate between the 2 stamps. Okay, so I'm going to repeatedly stamp this, and notice that my stamp wasn't clean. It really doesn't matter. Versamark ink is actually a very durable pad, so even if it's stained, it'll work just fine. I'm going to stamp this repeatedly, and then I'll add white embossing powder and heat set it. Now notice I only did a little area of leaves before I embossed. That's because I didn't want my ink to start drying on me. So I do just kind of an area of the leaves, and I heat emboss it, and then I'll go back to stamping the rest to cover the paper. Now it's time for the fun part of adding some color so we get the resist effect. I'm using Distress ink and heavily applying various colors of green over our embossed images. The more ink you put down here, the better, and it doesn't have to look pretty. I promise it'll look good in the end once we add the water. I'm using Distress inks because they react with water and move around nicely. If you don't have Distress inks, you could also use watercolor over your embossed leaves. So after I've completely covered this with as much green ink as I can, I'm going to put water on this, and it'll make the ink move around. And the leaves will resist that water. But instead of just using plain water, I decided I wanted to have some pearly shine. So I'm going to put some Perfect Pearl pigment powder into our water. This, when it dries, will leave a gorgeous shine to it. If you don't have the Perfect Pearls, you could skip the step and just use regular water. All I did was put a tiny little scoop of the Perfect Pearls into this water mist bottle, and it sprays out beautifully. So I'm generously spraying this inked piece with this Perfect Pearl water mix. And it is going to look very wet and messy at first, but when you let it dry and come back later, check out that pearly shine that you get. And the white heat embossed images resist all of the color. So you get a lot of texture and a lot of shine. Heat Emboss Resist has been around for a long time, and there are a lot of fun variations of the technique, so I encourage you to try them out. I kept this card simple by matting the resist piece that we created on white cardstock and adding it to a green note card. And I added a neat and tangled black Hello die cut to the front, and I put glossy accents on top for a little bit of shine. So there you have 3 fun ways to use embossing powder on your projects. Be sure to check out the newest issue of Scrapbook and Cards Today for more ideas. Thanks so much for watching.